he would meet people and he'd say, well, what's your name? He says, hey, nice to meet you. My name is Elimelech. And they said, wow, that's a unique name. What does that mean? And then he would say, oh, it means my God is king. Well, if your God is king, what are you doing over here? How come you left the place where, quote unquote, God, I say it tongue in cheek, existed? Now look at this in verse 1, because this is very important. We're talking about it. We're going to become a man who matters. We're going to have to learn how to handle crises. It says, now it came to pass in the days when judges ruled that there was a famine, underline the word famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell, underline the words dwell, in a country called Moab, he, his wife, and his 2 sons. Underline the word famine, underline the word dwell. Because when you think about it, okay, Chris, don't give the brother a hard time. Things are getting a little rough. He's just trying to look out for his family. He just went someplace else. But notice his intention was to dwell there. In other words, this was a short-term fix. In other words, he just was going to go to the credit cards for 1 month. In other words, he was just going to date an unsaved person for 1 date because he was tired of staying in. It wasn't going to be a long-term fix. He just needed something to try to fix the problem short-term. So he left house of bread and went to seed of my father. In the country of Moab, his wife, and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And the name of his sons was Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, or Judah. And they went to the country of Moab. Here we go, underline the next word, and remain there. He went to dwell initially, but he ended up remaining. And that's a good place to stop, because we want to be careful when we go to something for temporary relief and we remain there. There are men who will go to porn for temporary relief, just to ease the tension. We'll go to prescription drugs, or we'll go to alcohol, or we'll go to drugs, or whatever it might be, just to take the edge off a little bit, just to dwell there, just to get through the day, just to get through the week, just to get through the quarter. But if you're not careful, the enemy wants you to remain there. And we each have to ask ourselves, where are some of the places that we go to dwell, and now we've ended up remaining? Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons, and they took wives of the women of Moab. And the name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. And they dwelt there about, underline the next 2 words. Look at this. He went to dwell, then he remained. Now he stays there. He ends up 10 years there. When he went there initially, there's no way in the world Elimelech would have suspected that he would have stayed there that long. Why? Because his name is My God is King. But notice what a famine in your life can cause you to do. We're talking about if I'm going to become a man who matters, I've got to learn how to handle crises biblically. Here's a man, Elimelech. Most people, conventional wisdom would say, well, Chris, you're beating up on him. You're being hard on him. He was just trying to make ends meet. He was doing what you had to do, so to speak. But notice the route that he took. Notice what he forfeited, and notice where he went. He left house of bread and he went to seed of my father. And notice that he stays there 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died. So the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Now remember, Bethlehem means house of bread. Now this is a great principle that I always want to remind you. If you ever find yourself in a bad situation, or you find yourself perhaps seemingly out of the will of God, or you find yourself somewhat lost, you always want to go back to the place that you knew for sure you heard God's voice. You want to go back either to the church that you heard God's voice. You want to go back to the word that God gave you. But you all notice what happened. She says in verse 6, this is important, that she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab. For she heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. She was in a bad situation. Her husband put her and her kids in a bad situation. And her thought is, let me go back to the last place that I knew for sure. Here's what I'm trying to get at. I was in God's will. Let me go back to the last place that I knew for sure. There are people who leave God's will because a job pays more. There are people who leave God's will and switch locations geographically. You constantly want to ask yourself, when was the last place, the last time that I knew I was in God's will? Where was the last place that I knew for clearly I was hearing his word? What was the last thing he told me that bore a strong witness, and am I doing it? Because during a famine or during crises, it's easy to listen to a lot of voices. 1 Corinthians 14 talks about there are many voices out there, none without significance. In other words, there's a lot of voices. Even in Ephesians 6, it talks about spiritual wickedness in heavenly places or airwaves or trying to get audience with us. Elimelech, when a crisis set in, he moved away from the place where he was hearing God's voice and tried to find a worldly solution. And if we're going to become a man who matters, we're going to have to make sure we know how to handle crises and we're leveraging our tools when famine sets in. Verse 7, therefore she went from the place where she was, her and her two daughters-in-law with her, and she went on her way to return to the land of Judah. Now, I'm going to stop here. You know how the story goes, and if you don't, then I encourage you to get our teaching series on Ruth. But I just want to highlight a couple of key points on how to handle crises. Key observations from this story. Key observations from Elimelech's mistake. Key observations on how we can become a man who matters. Now, before I get into this is so powerful because, again, you must get the story. Most of you are familiar with the story of Ruth. But Elimelech left Bethlehem, house of bread, because a famine set in, and he went to Moab, trying to make things work. But do you know the whole time he was in Moab, God was prospering Boaz? In other words, if he had stayed in the same place and had the same conviction that Boaz had, he could have gotten the same results. As you know, Boaz was a wealthy farmer. I'm sure Boaz experienced the same famine that Elimelech did. But for some reason, Boaz chose to stay there. He chose to stay in house of bread. Famine didn't drive Boaz to go against his convictions. Famine didn't drive Boaz to take a short-term solution. This whole time that Elimelech is creating this terrible situation for his family, that same time period, Boaz is being blessed. And he could have been blessed as well had he stayed. Because God is bigger than your circumstances. And now he finds himself in a situation where he's left his wife, Naomi, and his two daughters-in-law, and all he has to show for his move is 3 obituaries.